Brian Sternberg was an amazing athlete who broke the world's record for the pole vault in 1963. Once, while working on a trampoline in preparation for a competition in Russia, he did something he'd done hundreds of times before, a double back somersault with a twist. This time, something went wrong, and he landed on his neck, leaving him a quadriplegic with little hope for survival. 5 years later, however, Brian was still alive and was asked to give a presentation to a group of athletes. When it was time to start, the auditorium went totally dark. Then a movie projector lit up and Brian Sternberg appeared on the screen, racing down the runway and executing that world record-setting pole vault. Everyone in the audience applauded. Then the auditorium went totally dark again, except for a solitary spotlight shining on a single chair on an empty stage. Out of the shadows came a huge football player, Wes Wilmer. In his arms, he carried Brian Sternberg. Wilmer placed him in the chair and then propped him up with pillows so that he wouldn't fall over. Then the raspy voice of Brian Sternberg began to talk. He said, "My friends, I pray that what has happened to me will never happen to any of you. I pray that you will never know the humiliation, the shame of not being able to perform even one human act." It's hard to imagine being Brian Sternberg, isn't it? It's hard to imagine suddenly losing the life you expected, the dreams you held, the future you planned. Yet as hard as that is to imagine, over the years, I've seen something like that happen countless times in so many people's lives. Our child is born with severe genetic issues, and suddenly our world has changed forever. Mom had a stroke. She has no money. There's no one to take care of her. So now she lives with us. I never thought I'd have to bury my beloved spouse or my precious child. Now I don't know how I'll go on or if I even want to. In whatever fashion the tragedy visits us, as it did for Brian Sternberg, sometimes we too lose the life we expected, the dreams we held, the future we planned. Then what? Today's scriptures give us a glimpse into that question. Now, there's so much in God's word for us today, but I focus on that moment when a couple of folks come up to tell Jesus that they want to follow him, but he first says, there's a lot you guys are going to have to leave behind. Life would not be as you expected. It won't be the future you planned. Now, what's going on here? I mean, what is this? I'll answer by part 2 of the Brian Sternberg story. We go back to that dark auditorium with a single spotlight falling on Brian Sternberg propped up in a chair on an otherwise empty stage. The raspy voice of Brian Sternberg had just said, "My friends, I pray that what has happened to me will never happen to any of you. I pray that you will never know the humiliation, the shame of not being able to perform even one human act." Then he adds, "But I must tell you that I finally met God. I now know in my heart the goodness of God." And he goes on, It is my hope and my prayer that what has happened to me would never happen to any one of you. But if that is what it takes for you to discover your need for God, then I pray that it does. Then this happened. Brian Sternberg looked up and smiled. Brian had come to know what lasts. Brian had come to know that there was indeed more for him than the life he had expected, the dreams he had held, the future he had planned. In the midst of his grief at his losses and the daily countless challenges he now faced just to eat and bathe and survive, he could smile because he had found what no one and no thing could take from him. He had come to know the goodness of God in him and around him, even in the loneliest and darkest of times. Today, Jesus invites some folks to live without stuff that they thought they had to have. And, they finally get up their courage to tell Jesus that they would follow him. And Jesus tells them, first, you got some letting go to do. Now, I feel for them. I think that for each of us, in any given moment, there's that which is hard for us to imagine living without, right? But Jesus knows that learning how to live without is one of the keys to authentic living, to being fully alive and free. Jesus knows that learning to live without is essential for our souls. And it is a temptation, I think, for each of us to think that we'll be able to secure a world where the main things won't change, right? It just doesn't work. Perhaps true security is to learn to not be too surprised by surprises, to know to expect some living without, because for each of us, without exception, there will be times when we will have to live without. And it is only if we get better at freely letting go of some things that we will better be able to let go when life strips them from us. Because life will. I know this is not easy. As I've quoted Anne Lamott before, I loved it when she wrote, "Everything I let go of has claw marks on it." Because I get that. But we do need to do the work of learning to let go. And if we do, we'll learn that we can be okay without a lot of the stuff we thought we could never be okay without. And to be better at that, we've got to think. We have to talk to ourselves concretely and rightly, and to ask the right questions and spend some time with them. Here are 4 key questions to end. They're on our webpage. Just go to the You Are Loved banner and click on homilies there. That way you can sit with those questions for a while because they are important. 1, in any transition we face, when we let go, what do we lose? What do we gain? And what stays the same no matter what? Two, sometimes it is good to look at past letting goes. Did we survive? What was hard about that? Did we find any blessings we did not expect along the way? 3, maybe it's good to ask, have we ever held on too long? And how did that work out? What would we do differently now? And 4, is there anything we might be holding on to right now that keeps us from being as alive as we could be? Why would we, or why wouldn't we let go? And what would help us to do so? The wisdom of our scriptures is that there is always some letting go and living without, and that it is worth it. It's worth it to know how to do that. Just ask Brian Sternberg.